open up the old broadcast webinar button, and we'll see if we can't find Danny. If not, we can, talk amongst ourselves until he gets back.
There he is.
Oh, cool. Preparing to live stream, setting up your webinar for custom streaming service. Thank you, Zoom.
That button. Okay, that one, isn't it? All right, I've got it.
All right. Bear with, and I'll just make sure we're live on the YouTubes. Oh, I've got a message from the next room, which is very socially distant of us, that it's live. Cool. All right, I'm just going to bring my screen back up. It's
you're freezing already. What's going on?
It'll come back. That might just be as it was plugging it in YouTube. Let me just turn my... Oh, good. All right. Sorry. So it's a weird process where you have to start the webinar and then send it to YouTube and then make sure it works on YouTube and then switch it off. But speaking of process, hello everyone, and thank you very much for coming along. We're going to be chatting, Danny and Connor and I, for hour and a half, and then we'll be doing some Q&A. So if this is the first time you've done a Zoom webinar, two things to bear in mind. Firstly, chat all you want, but make sure that you have selected all panelists and attendees, because otherwise, in theory, only me, Danny, and Connor will see it, and we're busy talking, so no one will see it. Now, as for questions, if you look down at the bottom of the screen, you'll see there's a Q&A button. So don't put your questions in the chat unless you want people in the chat to answer them, which is fine. Drop them in the Q&A, and when we are done with our discussion part, then we'll get to the questions. All righty. You guys good to go? How you doing?
I'm great.
Yeah.
Hi.
All right.
Good.
Well, let's have that as a first question. How are you feeling? How are we feeling at this present moment? Danny, you go. How are things?
How am I feeling?
Yeah.
Things are up and down, really. What can I say? It's quite heavy at home. I've been stuck with my kids and people for 2 months now, and it's a really interesting moment. People in England certainly seem to have had enough, I think, of this lockdown and all that kind of business. So I'm very curious and a little bit frustrated. I'm excited to be on tonight.
Oh, very good. What about you, Mr. Habib?
I gotta say I'm great. In some ways, never better. I'm feeling rather happy for the quietude and everything that this has afforded me and everybody here in Ireland. I, of course, am attuned to the challenges ahead of us, but besides that, I'm feeling rather happy. Yeah.
Fair enough. Yeah, it's definitely up and down. When I'm in a good mood, I think I've taken the time. We'll talk about this. I've taken the time to make sure my mental health is in the best possible position to find the upside of this exact current moment. And that, because if I hadn't done that, and I didn't to start with, there was a lot of the first 2 weeks of junk food in house arrest kind of situation, right? So it's up and down. So a couple of days ago, now that I hate these terms, and we'll get to that. Now that we're beginning to open up, we are allowed to go to a national park as long as it's within 30 kilometers of our house. So we did. We tried that the other day, and it's still closed. The roads are blocked for whatever reason. And that was a moment of this is a lot. I'm ready for this part of the adventure to be over. So I think I'm in the up and down camp there. I don't know. I think it's time. We'll begin with sort of the failure of critique and discourse, but people seem to think everyone's just waiting to go shopping rather than live their lives. And I think that's a very dangerous way to have this discussion. But broadly speaking, I think we all agree that there's been a just catastrophic failure of critique of where we're at, regardless of what, and this is in play, whatever you happen to think is going on. currently, right? Why do you think that is? Who wants to go first?
Okay. Well, I mean, part of it is just that, when you're talking about catastrophic critique or lack of critique, you're talking, I think, to people who identify as leftists mostly. Not that we don't ever talk to conservatives or anything like that, but I think that the people that we would turn to for some sort of critique of power structures and hierarchies and all that kind of stuff in a political way, yeah, I mean, they failed miserably. And a big part of that is just because they've discounted for decades any sort of spiritual, magical, occult, ideas. And also that goes hand in hand with accepting that, Western medicine, Western scientific traditions are somehow an ally of the left, which they are not. And, so I think that that's a lot of it. I think that people also, to be more generous, were just really confused. I mean, for weeks, we've been receiving conflicting messages right in the beginning. It was all very confusing and scary. And in most people's lifetimes, it seems unprecedented, although there are events that overlap with this. So I think that it was just that too. Like, you could hear the circus music in the background as people were trying to figure out what to do. So I think, those two things combined for sure. So there's the ungenerous and the more generous version of it.
That was very generous. You go, Danny. What do you think?
Yeah, that's more generous than I'm going to be. I think people just can't handle death, and I think the critique has begun with, "Oh, we're all dying," and if you start to say, "Well, maybe look at the numbers," how old were people a generation ago or 6 generations ago? Certainly, again, from the left, the response is, you're a murderer, or you're downplaying all this pain and all this thing that's going on. So I think it's I think there's this great big worry going on, and actually it's tapping into something deeper. I think we're generally unconsciously worried about some really, really big things that are going on, economically and environmentally and socially, and then suddenly we've got this I don't want to be unkind, blip in the data to suddenly worry about, and it seems like all of this fear is just bubbling up or rushing up to the surface. And I think there's a whole lot of reasons, there's a whole lot of reasons behind that, and we'll get into it, but I think basically fear of death and distance from death. We've had all these deaths. I think I think I was listening to you I think it was on your podcast actually, Connor. The statistic of 60% of the deaths in Ireland were in nursing homes. Similar statistics around here. It's the first time our old people haven't died at home. You know what I mean? And we're not familiar with that whole process of watching people get decrepit and dying with their family around them. So suddenly it's like, it's death. And it's difficult to critique when you're panicking.
It's 81% in Canada. Charles Eisenstein made a point in a really good essay recently that what would happen if you asked these people who are critically at risk in care homes what they would prefer: to die in a coma with a ventilator down their throat, or with an elevated risk to die at home with their family and grandchildren. It's a fear of death component. We don't do that. And this is kind of coming back to the failure of critique, right? I was thinking about it as putting the questions, or at least the topic areas, together for this discussion. It's that classic Hemingway line, how did you go bankrupt? Slowly at first, then all at once. So the failure of critique has been over decades of how we even get in this clusterfuck of a situation. Right. And then when we have a blip, it's a mess. It's the all at once moment. So I have a lot of frustration about the a bunch of stuff. And I think the long-term failure, part of it is this again, I'm talking mostly from a left perspective, and I think self-identified left is the right word, because there are, I can't get, particularly in an American context, people who identify as left and are happy voting for Biden, right? But I don't get what's going on with a critique of power and tyranny in that situation where, and it's funny, like what I did to prepare for this, right? I remember, like, I read it as a kid, Everything is Under Control by Robert Anton Wilson. And I found I'd lost it years ago, and I found a secondhand copy a couple of months ago in Hobart, and I bought it. And I had the back of my head memory of his introduction. And on the first page, he's talking about what's sort of weird is that conspiracy theory in the late 19th and early 20th century was the purview of the left. And it was sort of up through the mid 20th century until you get John Birch Society and you get the CIA actually using the term conspiracy theory, because it has always been equality movements and suffrage movements and activist groups that have always been infiltrated and disrupted. So the critique of power, and it's been the left that's been looking at the combination of what is like essentially a combined predator class, right? And that's sort of been what it's about. And now we have people carrying water for an unelected billionaire project, marching in lockstep with Donald Trump and Mike Pompeo, and the left is, the people who identify as left are doing free policing for this, rather than going, whatever you, hang on a minute. These are the things we talk about. These are the things that are in the world that we don't want in the world. And I think that's the long-term bit that I'm a bit surprised at. I don't know, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, well, that's also just been building because of the absolute disaster of the environmentalist movement, which has primed us for the past few decades to side with materialistic scientism, blended with, the posture of spirituality when it actually isn't there, and the corporate interests blended with the state. That are directing those narratives, and not to say that there's nothing worthwhile or valuable in those narratives, or that hasn't given us anything. But I mean, we've been primed for this, for a really long time. So I think that that's part of it as well, when you're talking about the lead up to it. And of course, those things are blended together in this narrative as well. Yeah, and I just, I mean, I think we've talked about this before, but, the left rightfully became suspicious of mysticism and occultism and all that after World War II, because they saw it being deployed, and they were very actually clear-headed about it in that way when they saw that it was used by the Nazis. What their failure was, taking it seriously. They saw it as a project of just social control, but they didn't understand that that was a real spiritual project that was going on. So when they fought back, and again, rightfully so, they did it by trying to sort of disempower and dismiss the actual potency and truth behind those projects, rather than addressing them as such and helping immerse us in counter occult projects. So I think it's been going on for a long time in different arenas. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think the left's really used to dealing with a situation where people aren't doing so much dying. If you look at the history of the left, it's poor-ish working class communities in crowded slums and that kind of thing. At least that's a lot of the roots. And we're in a very unprecedented situation where it's kind of it's a very difficult and new thing for the left. I also think that I think Karl Popper's got a lot to answer for, really, especially around his framing of conspiracy theory as, let's say, a kind of folk theology for the uneducated. This idea that there are no, now we don't have any gods to believe in. People have to create these conspiracies in order to have something to believe in. And this kind of very logical, godless way of looking at things has really stuck. And there's a lot of people talking about conspiracy theory, not mentioning his name, but who seem to have really bought into that idea that, yeah, we're too stupid to deal with uncertainty. And then if you do critique the panic, you're very quickly thrown into a bag full of conspiracy theorists who are morons.
And the level of hypocrisy in that statement is fascinating, right? Because it's like, oh, you can't deal with uncertainty. I'm like, you're listening to the guy who didn't even invent DOS on medicine. You want to talk about certainty. You're happy with that. You think everything's fine there. Now, as a student of history, I think this is a James Corbett line, but like history equals conspiracy theory plus time, right? So when you study history, that's what happens. But all of a sudden, in the last 3 decades, our elected betters like Trump and Pompeo and Bill Gates are like, and the Brits as well, especially at the moment with Cummins and whatever, that's like in play. They're suddenly, once they get elected, they're beyond corruption. Does that sound like our world? And I'm trying to understand what it is that has made blue check leftists in the kind of, no offense, Connor, I know you have a blue check.
I beg your pardon.
I'm just trying to get what happened there. How did they, especially when, if you're talking about certainty, there's no, and we'll kind of get to the dangers of using things like science and data to frame life value. But even on that level, there is no scientific evidence to support like any of the things that we're currently doing. And yet, is it just a fear reaction? Is it because we're not used to death? I have this concern. I have the kind of more anarch side of left critique concern that this is a love of power. I think that people are secretly happy. People like blue check leftists, the sort of like blue no matter who. I think they're secretly happy at this like draconian application of scientist power, because I think it comes with the worldview, and if you have to actually take the time to unpick it out of the worldview, and if you don't, it kind of it takes you hostage. I don't know, thoughts?
I wonder if it's like as much a love of being disempowered or a disability to grow up, man. It's like it's as if we've eaten up this infantilization, and now, like I saw it was, I can't remember who it was, someone I probably stopped following now on Twitter, but they said something along the lines of when the second spike hits, you know, when the reinfections happen, who's going to be held accountable? Like, it's a virus, man. Like you know, and looking around for the guy who's responsible. So I think we put these people in power, and then we really enjoy it when they fall. Like Dominic Cummins is a perfect example, you know.
Yeah, the infantilization or the self-infantilization is a very good point that we should probably dwell on, because that's been one of the things that they've used to, and this is a kind of very Zizek critique, but it's fair, is that people have replaced that kind of identitarian construction of weakness. They've confused that with, again, like a left perspective, and that's that kind of classic Peterson-Zizek debate, right? And this just feeds right into that, because people can treat this like it's a day off school lasting 2 months, where they can eat ice cream and be under a blanket, and the daddies, the mummies and daddies, can kind of take care of it. And it just, again, it rankles. I think and everyone can like land where they want in their framing of the event and what we're going to do about it individually and collectively. I'm just really surprised at the fucking tumbleweeds. Are we just, I don't know. I'm really surprised at the fucking tumbleweeds when it comes to the critique.
Yeah, I mean, look, I feel like whenever you and I talk, I'm always like a little sweeter and more generous than you, but let me
when
try.
you talk to Alex on Skeptico, you go crazy.
Well, let me just try again, which is that, you know, it's not just us, you know. I mean, there's the approach of spiritual beings that have a vested interest in making us think this way as well, and people who are working with them to bring about this kind of fragmented thinking that splits us into understanding identities as kinds of nations that have to be defended at all costs. We're experiencing the kinds of fragmented thinking that engaging in digital media, which itself is a series of fragmented waves translating information into little bits as if we're looking at a flip book. So even just the medium is tending towards the kind of fragmented thinking that, you know, we see on there, in the fragmented art and the lack of continuity. And that is, in fact, a being who is composed of scientistic materialism. And so it's not just us failing. You know, we're experiencing the proximity of something that is calling that up. And so we have a challenge, which is to overcome it. And I think I agree with you that we're not doing enough to face that challenge, but this kind of thing was going to happen no matter what. It's just that we're not handling the challenge as it's coming very well, but like it was bound to happen to us, you know.
Sure. So let's move that into, and it's a leading question, but it's a good one. And I think you can ask this for people who are kind of still a bit like, oh, you just want to get how many grandmas does a haircut cost? Like, ask the question.
Two.
It's two. Okay. Yeah.
It's not that much.
It's a leading question, but I want to pose it to both of you to sort of trigger the discussion. Does the state have a monopoly on expertise? Like, it's an emphatic no, but you know, it's a really good question when you get that. Like, you know, stay home, stay safe. Does the state have a monopoly on expertise? Like, fuck off.
I mean, that's been the liberal state's proposition for a really long time. You know, like the conservative state's proposition has been a proposition of enjoyment. We're not about experts. Just go out and have a good fucking time. Like, shoot some guns. Like, you know, get, you know, like jump off the back of a moving truck, all that kind of shit, whatever, right? And so I'm not even critiquing these things. I'm just sort of pointing out that that's what they are. Whereas the liberal, you know, the liberal state's proposition is that we're going to assemble experts to bring together, you know, people in a way that's sort of more loving and isn't just about enjoyment, but it's really about taking care of each other and being stewards of Mother Earth and all this shit, right? So the conflict between experts and enjoyment has been going on for a really long time in the political arena, but like what we don't realize is that, you know, like the liberals push experts and it's for their own enjoyment, and that the conservatives push enjoyment and like it's all led by cutthroat experts behind the scenes who are manipulating all of that, right? And that all of that's enforced by violence. And so, and the enjoyment and expertise of the deployment of violence. So I think it's, you know, there's a muddle there because there are people, right, that don't appreciate the words of experts. It's like hearing brainy Smurf, which to me is just the most annoying fucking thing in the world. As I know it is for you, Gordon, where it's like, excuse me, you know, like shoe engineer here. I think I have quite a bit to say about coronavirus. You know, like
job title here tweets die.
Yeah. Exactly. And so, you know, I think it's, I think we are in the sway of that illusory clash. And so people defer to the expert side because they are afraid of the enjoyment side. And also they think that the enjoyment side makes them look like conservatives who are punching someone at Red Lobster because it took 3 hours for their meal to be. You know.
That's so important. I will get to Danny in a sec, but that's so important that to be pro pleasure and kind of and pro life. I was going to say pro life, and I'm like, I don't mean it that way. You know, you know. To be pro-pleasure is conflated with wanting to go shopping, and that's just bullshit. That's like this. There's a self-policing on the liberal side. But anyway, Danny, what do you think?
I think they've got a monopoly on violence,
Mhm.
a monopoly on power. I mean, leading up to this, over the last 5 years, 10 years, as long as people have been paying attention, really, I think a lot of us have lost faith in the expertise of the experts who are behind, you know, the mouthpieces of the state and the violence that it's about to commit on its people. And I'm quite surprised, but then again, I'm not surprised, because when we're threatened with pain and death, which is why I'm so interested in the philosophy of medicine, history of medicine, because you really learn about someone's philosophy when their life is on the line, or when they think their life is on the line, or when they're in pain. Then you hear about it, and I'm quite surprised that people have run back to these experts who, and I'm using that as a kind of general term, government-approved experts, who have just disgraced themselves so many times over and over again in recent history. But then again, I'm not surprised, and I wonder, kind of looking at a more long profile, if this is the kind of almost the final nail in the coffin of their monopoly of expertise, and maybe even the monopoly on violence as well. You know what I mean? It's certainly pretty.
Yeah. I don't think we've lost faith in them. I think they've squandered our faith, and it's. But I agree. I'm surprised. I was surprised that 60% of people are not going to materially return to how they existed without a vaccine, and they want it to be mandatory. And I'm like, you haven't been near a history book for a while. That's not good. That, like, the story of empire is a biological story, right? And I'm like, I know what you mean about it, but I 100% agree that this will be the final failure of an anti-life cosmology. I'll do this as a leading question for you both next, right? Like, so leading question one is the world viewing this challenge with an anti-life cosmology? And I kind of mean that in an Ahrimanic sense, actually, Connor. And what does it look? So this is the follow-up leading question. What does it look like from again, I'm going to say pro-life, but you know what I mean, but like a living universe cosmology? Because I see something, and I think you guys do as well. I see something very different in where we are. But who wants to take that first?
What was the first question again, Gordon?
It's an is the world approaching this from an anti-life cosmology? And what does it look? And I think part of this is the data thing, right? It's the sort of how many grandmothers does a haircut cost? But it's the whole thing. It's the whole managerial, and this is the bit, the expertisism on the liberal left. So again, I hate, you guys know what I mean, but the expertisism on the liberal left is, if you don't unpick it, it comes along with it. It's like nits in your hair or something, because it's literally how the kind of like tanky status left organized itself over the last 150 years, about like, we will get experts and they will manage a planned system. And that's baked in, and it doesn't work. It doesn't work. And that's not like a Soviet versus capitalism critique. That's just, it just doesn't work. It doesn't work anywhere, right? And I think that, and we're using that, where it's the same kind of expertisism, command economy approach, and it's anti-life. That was my question. What do you think, you guys?
I'm going to answer that from a perspective of the brain. I'm a hypnotherapist. That's my day job. And one of the things that kicks in, you know, when, again, back to this fear, one of the things that happens when you're scared is the normal processes of, like, if you meet a tiger in the street, for example, the normal processes of life break down. So you're not digesting your food, you know, your respiration changes, menstrual cycle changes, You know, so if people are under stress for a long time, they can get skin complaints and their hair will fall out because they're not doing the normal maintenance, the normal routines of the body. And I kind of think, you know, the first response to fear is generally freeze. You know, you hear a twig snapping in the woods. The first thing is freeze, and then you've either got the option of fight or flight. And I think we're in kind of that phase where, or the initial response was life preservation, as you can understand. And then almost a kind of a flight thing. And I wonder if this, you know, you mentioned this thing about the you know, you're not an epidemiologist, so you're not qualified to comment on this, which you see all over the place, right? It feels like, you know, you're not my daddy, so you don't have an opinion. And I think that kind of feeds into this anti-life thing or this anti-enjoyment thing. You know, it's far too serious to be having fun. And if you are having fun, I mean, I'm having fun. And I wonder if, like for example, I live in Hastings, which is by the sea. And a couple of weeks ago, my kids were down by the sea, and they dipped into the sea, and then they came out, and then they went back into the sea, and the cops came and stopped them and said, you know, if you're in the sea, you're exercising, but if you're in the sea and then out of the sea and then in the sea again, you're hanging out at the beach. And I'm just trying to think of that in any perspective other than like just the hate of fun, you know?
Yes, agreed. Connor?
Is it anti-life? It's anti-spirit, you know. I mean, the livingness is a necessary component, but for what's happening here. But yes, I mean, things being broken down into numbers. It's really surprising to me. Like, if you looked at all those like charts where it was like the curve and the flattening and all that kind of shit and all the lines, and I just thought this looks exactly like palmistry. Could we not maybe see it in a magical way that's like predictive instead of like this crazy like you know, like Elon Musk baby name fucking broken down into letters and numbers that nobody can fucking understand to like pick things, you know. I mean, I think that the anti-life equation type thinking, to give it its sort of dark side reference there, I think that, again, I get, you know, not to be a broken record, but I just think that that's been, or a broken Spotify. I think that that kind of fragmentation has been happening for a really long time, and it's been underway for a really long time. And the reduction of all processes into anti-spirit processes has been going on forever. I mean, it's just like, you know, well, when you fall in love with somebody, it's just chemicals in your brain, and it's just like, you know, it's not like a real thing, it's just this and that, you know, like that kind of shit, I think has been really, you know, a project that again is related to certain spiritual currents and spiritual impulses. The real problem that we're facing now with it is that, I mean, this harmonic being, which you brought up, that's bad news, but it's actually like small potatoes compared to some of the other things that are, you know, in the wings, which want to crowd out the spirit and the capacity to be an I altogether. And to, yes, in your way you're saying, reduce us into sort of numerical, physical, quantitative, you know, like values of information. And I mean, if you look at, it's like, again, really long, it's been happening for a really long time. I mean, Hegel's whole proposition, which Marxism stems out of, is that we're just everything's just ideas. If you're just talking to someone, you're an idea interacting with another idea. And then Marx, you know, takes that out of that realm and says, well, no, it's not, no, the ideas aren't even real because there's no God and there's no spirit. It's just material, like shit talking to material shit. And the talking is also materialistic, informational, blah, blah, blah. not to, I mean, Marx offered a lot of valuable things to us, but they just got extremely confused and extremely degraded over time. So again, like, I'm just pointing to the fact that this has been going on for a really long time. And I think your Hemingway, paraphrase there is really useful. It's like, it's just collapsing right now. And because of that, there's so much opportunity for us, right now as well. But it's a window of opportunity that will last us probably about 12 years at the most. And then we're going to have a fork in the road where we can go one way or the other. And if we don't get our shit together in the next 12 years, we're probably in it for another few hundred years, which I am not looking forward to.
I think the anti-life component, I'll view it from a Gnostic perspective. It feels like the demiurge is a tyrannical 5-year-old having her birthday party, and you sit here, you don't play with that, that's mine, you go over here now, we eat this. And it's this kind of attempt to the anti-life component is this bold and ultimately doomed proposition that you can replace all human interactivity with a synthetic, spaced out version. So it's like you don't get physical contact with your family. Like, try Zoom. Like, and I'm just really alarmed at the amount of people that are being the unpaid policemen for, that's kind of what I mean by the anti-life component of it. If we were trying to save lives, like, are we trying to save lives, which is that fear of death thing instead? Like, so is what we're doing in support of life or not? And the thing is, there's a bunch of ways where it isn't. Like, it just isn't, because if you want to do the numbers, like, obviously this the tactics we have used will cause more destruction than they save. Like, that's, if we want to do the numbers game, that's been self-evident from the beginning. It's not an issue. It's more, do you think these things are serving life or not, when we had other options? Like, there have been other countries that have done different things. Like, this is I do a Hemingway thing for the valuation of life. Like, perhaps if we hadn't isolated our old folks out into care homes in the first place, we would have a different understanding. And perhaps if we valued them more when this happened, we would have done what Sweden now admits it should have done from the beginning, which is like lock down care homes instead. Like, it's this weird thing where we have people being unpaid policemen for an anti-life project and it's coming out of fear, because it doesn't even its foundational propositions aren't even true. And I'm really confused by what we do about that, because I agree there is an opportunity, but we're in like how to say this right? The opportunity will be challenging to seize, because it's going to need to be navigated, at least initially, in an almost like clandestine fashion. And I'll get to what I mean by that. Like, in a way, a form of agorism has already emerged, right? Because people are still doing their thing. They're making their own decisions. And so whilst, hair salons and nail salons and whatever, sex workers, all the rest of, well, it depends whether it's legal, right? People are actually just trading and interacting outside the state anyway. And I think that's very interesting and encouraging. And that's the bit that I'm trying to, I think that's where we are now. I don't know. What do you reckon?
Yeah, well, I just want to say one more thing. I mean, I know this is taking it a step further, but perhaps this will help sort of flesh it out. And maybe we'll get to this or maybe not. But we know, for instance, that like microwave frequencies are harmful to insects, right? Don't worry, this will all sort of come back. We know, for instance, that microwave frequencies are harmful to insects. I mean, it's been demonstrated time and time again. So if we want to trust experts, we can ask entomologists everywhere that microwave frequencies are hard for insects. And the kinds of microwave frequencies that we have, the electromagnetic frequencies we have that is circling the Earth right now, are nothing compared to the 30,000 proposed Spacelink satellites that are about to go up, or Starlink satellites that are about to go up from Elon Musk and all this kind of shit. So What is being proposed right now to deal with the problem of insects being hurt by frequency is we want to create robot bees to pollinate the flowers, right? So what we have is this weird thing where the anti-life equation thinking that you're talking about is a given by the people and institutions in power, right? So like the thing that needs to happen, I mean, there's a lot of distrust of people and institutions in power. There's not a lot of political potency and will to be able to confront them just yet. And we're generating that. And I actually think that this quarantine period has given a lot of people the time to regenerate a kind of breathing potency response to what's happening. And that's part of why you're seeing this multitude in Hart and Negri terms, like resistance of just sort of shrugging off the state, because there's a new sort of power and confidence in being able to do that. But there's going to also need to be a confrontation with the fact that it's a foregone conclusion on the part of people and institutions in power that that's what's going to happen, that the anti-life shit is just the baseline of what's going to happen. And so now we are also going to be enticed to fall under the spell of that in many ways. And it's going to be wrapped into all the kinds of demands that we make, you know, for a better political world and all that kind of stuff. So that's just, again, just to say, like, some of it is that the potency has been regenerated, tied to the fact that people just do not trust these institutions in varying ways. But we have to remember that their baseline is this very thing that you've brought up and that you're talking about. And that's alluring in a different way altogether. And it's horrific and fucking crazy as well, you know.
The blind idiot god demiurge. It's literally crazy, and it's amazing that it's worked. Like, for an animist, I'll get to it because you know Danny's in that world as well. Life is relational. And so there has never in human history been an assault on life literally like this. You're composed in relation, and to not be able to be in relation, it's like the evil one has been planning this for millennia. Like, it's impressive. It's really impressive. We got there's a Q&A question for a bit later. We just dropped Danny off. So let's go back to I think he'll come back in a minute, but let's go back to, well, different way of saying it. Let's move to, if this is where we are, and there is and I kind of feel that too. I think there's a sense of, oh, he's back. That's good. Did you want to jump in there, Danny? What do you think?
I did actually. Yeah, I just wanted to add something. Sorry about the sound. I just lost the sound there for a second. I wanted to add something to what you said. You mentioned the sheer numbers of people that are, let's say, policing on behalf of the state. I also want to bring in the sheer cruelty of it as well. And I'm particularly thinking around denying people access to their dying relatives or their sick relatives. You know, there was a couple of cases. There was a 13-year-old kid here in England who died on his own and then had a funeral on his own. There have been, you know, I had a big row with my folks not so long ago, a few months ago, and they're old. My folks are old. They're 78, 79. And I actually made a point of making up with them well before COVID, because I just had a, you know, obviously it's the right thing to do. And then they got sick, and they got COVID, and they were really ill, but they didn't want me to come. They wouldn't let me come and look after them, you know. And I think I've already had it. I think my whole family had it. But so they were kind of terrified into this situation where they were basically, you know, they didn't die. They got through it fine. The guy who gave it to them died. Yeah, so that kind of, the degree to which people are being cruel to themselves and also cruel to each other is something quite new, and I'm quite interested in the impact of that in terms of this, in terms of what next, in terms of potentially the weakening power of the state. Because you know, just looking at it this particular plane, that's a lot of pain. You know, if people have lost their parents and they haven't been able to say goodbye, for example, that's not something you forgive very quickly. And especially if they are going to be analysing different results out of, you know, and it does become clear that the lockdown was just nonsense. I wouldn't forgive that.
Yeah.
And then on another, and that will add to, and in the same way that kind of the whole lockdown thing is increasing whatever mental health issues are kicking around anyway, you know, I think it's making the whole thing into a bit more of a tinderbox. That's one thing. And then on another level, what about the ghosts? You know,
Oh yeah.
what are they going to do?
Yep. Well, that's like the pain. The funeral one is most obvious, but so my cousin had to cancel her wedding. You see those videos of kids, like 6-year-olds, having parties where their friends are just driving by and they can't see them. And the thing from a cosmic perspective, that pain is in the universe. So it's not even like, can we conflate it down to numbers, even if it's not just deaths, which are sad, like, and certainly not being able to grieve the dead, but this interruption of life and policing, as you say, it's cruel to the self and it's cruel to others for, like, shame on you for putting people in that sense of guilt or fear over what is already painful, because that feeling is in the universe. And as for the ghost, the premium members have been discussing that, like, what do we do? Because this is we've closed houses of worship, so we've closed like ongoing ritual, and we're also not moving the dead back home correctly. That's bad business.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just yes.
Yes, and what's the impact of it as well? You know, it's bad business, but you know, those guys haunt places, and I'm interested in the kind of transformative nature of that pain as well, because when we realize how horrible we've been to each other, you know, a lot of it over Zoom, in fact, or over social media, because we haven't got the liberty to go and be horrible to each other in person. I think there's going to be, I like to hope there's going to be some examination of, you know, of who's to blame for this.
I think we're going to be in a situation where people will, and it's sort of happening now, the blue check free policemen will just go on thinking they're right and be on to the next thing. I think a lot of the kind of the idiotic rank and file that's sort of fallen into line behind the state. I hope so. I hope people like us will actually, and I've certainly been sitting with it, but I hope people like us will do that. I'm just a bit worried. I do think there's something to what Connor was saying, that it's almost like an accumulator of possibility for changing one's position with the state, because it's so unusual, right? Like, by the time whatever's going on moves into the next phase, there will be sort of very real digital controls over where you are and aren't allowed to go, supermarkets, airlines, whatever, right? So in one respect, state power has taken a giant leap forward. But in the other respect, as Connor was saying, more people are realizing, like, you can actually just slough that off. You can actually just go, no, and have that not be on you in many respects. And I think that's going to be, there's an opportunity to tap into, for the right reasons, that growing sense of unrest and an inarticulate anger or dissatisfaction. What do you reckon?
Or a growing sense of rest, right? Like, when people are forced to stay in their homes for 3 months and they start realizing what they do and do not need in a lot of ways, and are forced to confront that, even on a level where they're not actually able to sort of articulate it, you know, in a way, but they're like, you know, okay, I've got to get along with the person I'm in this house with. I've got to confront my own thoughts. I've got to look at the fact that for months I've been trying to figure out how to pay rent, and now it's really come to the fore. I've got to cook my own food. Hey, actually, I kind of like that. I can garden, I guess, you know. I don't really need the restaurant anymore. I don't really need this. I don't really need that. And engaging in acts. By the way, my sleep has changed because the vasoconstricting sound of traffic, which happens at a certain level of hertz, which changes the size of my veins, has gone away or dimmed, where I am. So my dreams have transformed. I'm thinking about people dying. I'm confronting the fact that people around the world are dying, even as I'm afraid, I think, as Danny is pointing out really well, I might be afraid of my own death. Maybe I know somebody who died and I can't go and grieve in this like grieving ritual kind of way, but I do now have to think about how I'm going to create my own pathway into grieving. Or maybe the ghosts will be around and shock us into the realization that ghosts are real. All these kinds of things are happening, and I think that that's what I mean. It's like what's happening right now is this process of breathing, which of course is interesting in a time of a sort of supposed respiratory infection. A kind of breathing that's a reinvigoration of the soul is allowed to happen. And we have the possibility of creating our own kinds of rhythms and our own kinds of approaches to the day, which are not imposed upon us by all sorts of structures. And so that, I think, regenerates, like what I'm saying, that this is Franco B. Fabrati's term, but the potency, but I would say it's the etheric realm, our reconnection with the etheric. And so that re-engagement that's happening for a lot of people, not everybody, but a lot of people right now, I think that that's leading to that kind of possibility of shaking the state off and taking new kinds of actions in your life. And we should notice it only took a few months. I mean, that's really
yeah. Well, so you'll love this, Connor, of course, but there's a Jungian notion that like one archetype summons its opposite. So when you deploy or mobilize shall we say, the archetype of the demiurge, like the evil one of total control, the counter response is so quick, right? So what you're talking about is all living things. It's like gardening, and this is, I guarantee you, this is what's behind the sourdough fad. Sourdough is alive, right? That's the whole point. And it's that, and there is an opportunity there, and a bit, the challenge that's always been, I mean, probably Danny will agree with this, maybe you as well, Connor, maybe you will. The challenge has always been that when you have a moment like that, please don't gather a bunch of people and pitchforks and storm the Bastille, because like we've done that. This isn't how we surf that energy into a better world. It's PK Dick, whoever fights the empire becomes the empire, right? And so there's a real, and we're kind of, this is where I wanted to get to in this moment. What are the tools? And this, well, actually, Danny, if you want to pick up there, because the final bit is like, what are the tools available to us? And I want to start with intellectual ones and then move forward. But I don't know, what do you think? Did you want to add something there?
Yeah, I do, actually, to what Connor said, this moment of breathing, and also this moment of, for a lot of people, kind of celibacy, and more than that, just being stuck in. Basically, what I'm saying is, I think that there's a potent pool of libido which has been building up, and I mean that in a broad sense of the energy to transform stuff, the energy that gets stuff changed and births new things. And I'm thinking, and when that rises, its nature is to ground, is to find something to ground into. So I was just thinking of the 3 mile queues outside McDonald's that have just popped up. Apparently, McDonald's is open, great, let's go and eat shit. And that's in a sense, that's libido, finding something to ground into. And I'm quite interested in this next bit, what we come up with, because there's all this tension, right? There's lots of horniness for change, and horniness and desire to ground. And where are we going to put it?
Horniness for change is the political poster we need right now. That's what we should have called this video. I love that. I think that's really good, and it brings up, because we all kind of came at it from we kind of had our own hands on the same elephant there, right? And I guess that's step one in what do we do with this moment? Like, and I specifically mean what intellectual tools. I guess I potentially mean what critical tools, because I do want to finish off by talking about the spiritual or cosmological tools. I prefer, I guess, cosmological and metaphysical ones because I'm looking at it from an animist perspective. But I want to have a discussion about who are the people or ideas in that Marilyn Strahern sense, like it matters what thoughts we think with, that we can use to look at our kind of like our political situation or where we are, because I think there's not enough of it, and I want people to come away from the video going like, okay, cool. So then, how should I go about, like, what short thoughts should I think about our situation with? So, do you have any suggestions of that, like intellectual or critiquing tools that we can that may offer some insight? Maybe they don't, but they may offer some insight.
Mm-hmm. Do you want us to name specific thinkers, or you want us to give
even just ideas, like even just different ways of thinking about it? Like you could, but whichever one, because I just think, and it's the Hemingway thing again, right? Like particularly I'm looking at more from a left perspective, because there's a whole bunch of stuff that's it's the slowly at first all at once. There are people out there whose hearts are in similar places to ours, but their minds are in the fucking toilet, and they don't need to be. You know what I mean? There's an opportunity to do something with that sense, like in a funny way. I think it was Thaddeus Russell, of all people, said this recently on a podcast I listened to. It's not, although the science of it is garbage, like the masks, right? But it's not actually the state enforcing masks that's making people wear them. It's, if people ask what an anarchist response to a pandemic is, it's everyone for like mutual assistance wearing masks. And I think that's a really interesting way of looking at how we organize our behavior. It doesn't necessarily need to be a like Fauci finger wave. There are other ways of thinking with not just our behavior, but our options, I think. So that's sort of kind of what I mean. Like, what are other reframings we can use that might be more beneficial?
Yeah. So yeah, to start with sort of intellectual tools, I would say that, I mean, we've talked about this before, but I still think that this is the right thing to do, which is when you are trying to, when you find yourself scared of something that's going to happen, whether it's increased police powers or it's the elimination of cash, in favor of digital currencies that are trackable and, turned into sort of punishment devices and all this kind of, whenever you find yourself afraid of something, realize that that's actually the place where you start your vision and your action. So like, I'm afraid of increased police powers. Okay, wait, how about what does the world look like without police? Okay, let me actually just put that up. Let me think of a positive vision. Okay, so communities engage in loving and caring conflict resolution when it arises in a way that we all know each other and deal with it. So the police are irrelevant, but you don't even have to say the police are irrelevant, just create the positive statement. And then work, see how it is now and figure out how you get from there to here. And all you have to do, really, it's very simple, is you lay out the steps to make it happen, and you do the steps one by one. And maybe it doesn't have a worldwide effect. And of course, you will probably meet some resistance from people and institutions in power along the way. But if you can get your block or your building to do that, I mean, think about the resonating power that has. If you can, if you can get your family to do that, that's like a big deal. So like, it's that kind of thing, using the fear as the place to start the positive vision, and then sort of working from there to, the sort of positive vision. That's just a purely intellectual tool. I mean, there's a spiritual aspect to it, as there is with everything, but there's lots of other spiritual things I can talk about too, but I think that that's a place to start.
What about you,
yeah,
Dan?
I think that the localism that Connor's bringing up there, we've seen what happens when we rely on really fragile supply chains that go around the world, and we knew that was a lot of people knew that that was extremely unstable anyway, but now it's a bit more in your face, you know. So in England, for example, we've got gin distilleries have started making hand sanitizer, you know, to give one example. So that kind of economic localism, and
That's a tragedy, Danny, but anyway, yeah.
a tragedy about the gin. You can probably still drink it, you know. Yeah, so that's part of it. The economic, you know, mutual aid on a local level is one. I would say also, again, it's an intellectual tool, but comparative history is always a good place to start, because we find ourselves so rootless, you know, so confused, and this is an unkind thing to say, but often it feels like it's for want of reading a few books, you know.
Yep.
So maybe that's another thing that people are doing whilst they're on their lockdown, is reading a few books. But I guess particularly like comparative history, comparative medicine as well, looking at different medical traditions. And, you know, if you do that, you it's rare that you find a medical system which doesn't attribute meaning to disease or misfortune. Right?
Yeah. That's the second half where we go from a spiritual perspective for sure. Because I want to jump in there. I was going to do the history one too, but like basically, if you find yourself in a situation, which you have in your life, where you go, I don't have a good model of how history and medicine interact. I don't have a good model of the understanding of how medicine plays out in Western politics. I should go find one. And I don't think enough people do that, right? So I wrote that big post, which relied very heavily, and I think it's the first place to start is Foucault when it comes to like medicine in the state, because we have that whole discourse because of him. But I think that's a really good example. And the other one, and it relates too, it's if you are sitting with the question of I'm not sure, I'm all at sea with where I sit politically at the moment, then there's a couple of things you can recognize. That progressivism there's a Venn overlap, but it's not identical to like leftism. So there are critiques there that don't actually rely on a technocratic managerialism that I think are more rather than less urgent. And if you don't know them, find them. Like these intellectual tools are available, and a big one is like an understanding of history and an understanding of how medicine and power interrelate, I think is quite urgent. If you're looking to make, and these are just intellectual tools, because we'll certainly get to the comparative medical stuff right now, but I think that's where I want people to go. I want people to know that this is not new. Like we have some real clever people who have put a big chunk of their lives at going, okay, here's some frameworks for understanding. Maybe we look at them before we bully people on the internet based on, frankly, pseudoscience. Like I think there's some work we can do, like some real valuable tools there.
Yeah, and let me just add to that, to the history part. The history between World War I and World War II is a really good history to look at right now, because that's actually quite similar to where right now in time. There's a lot there, and that includes spiritually, by the way. So much fascinating stuff happening with spirituality and the occult between those two periods. So you can check into that, but make sure you find good sources and not some idiot academic who thinks the occult is loony and weird and wacky. And you know, I also think that there are like very sort of practical things we can do in orienting ourselves to the coming technocratic maneuvers. And we can look into people who have done historical, theoretical work around that and really investigate it, because we have a lot to contend with that. And part of that is looking into technologies, and I mean technologies in the sort of standard sense. I don't mean a lot of the ways that all three of us talk about techne in different forms, but technologies that are enriched by spirituality and the occult, whether it's radionics, orgone accumulators, whether it's golems, all the kinds of technologies that require direct consciousness interface to become active, healing machines, these kinds of things. I think that it's time for us to start thinking about and imagining tech in a way that doesn't flow into the current that is coming our way, and also just to pay attention to the way tech is about to be utilized. I think that that's important.
Well, yeah, you
bring something
want to
again.
have a robust critique of technology as well, and you get that if you start with medicine, you do Foucault, you'll get a bit of that with technology, and that can kind of jump you off. But you're completely correct there that this is what I mean. It's funny, like in some respects I approach it, it's either a chaos magic thing or it's a background in media business thing. If I look at a challenge ahead of me, I'm like, well, I don't have sufficient frameworks of understanding for this and this and this. Rather than pop off at my neighbors, maybe I go and find out. And it just seems like that's the right move forward if you want to get somewhere good. And I think that's really good at the moment. It's kind of why I asked the question towards the beginning, like, does the state have a monopoly on expertise? Like, the answer is no. And in fact, I don't think it, at least at the moment, has even assembled a particularly good expertise collection, right? And there are certainly better ones out there, which unless Danny wants to jump in there, otherwise, like my example is, we can now look at comparative medicine and ask what these challenges look like from different indigenous or animist or whatever South Asian healing modalities, right? Because it looks very, very different with I would argue like a more haunted or at least kind of internally consistent cosmology. But is there anything you want to jump in there, Danny?
Yeah, I'd like to say, the history between World War I and World War II. Well, it didn't end well, did it? And I think one of the things that we want to take from that is, here's one of the tools that doesn't help, although it's fun, is satire. That period being the golden age of satire. And I think, making chippy comments and satirizing stuff particularly on social media, really keep that to a minimum, I would say. And yeah, go and read some books. And the books I would recommend were, Ethan Waters is brilliant. Crazy Like Us, that's a kind of medical anthropology book. That would be a really good one to start with. And then actually one that comes to mind is Robert Anton Wilson as well, in terms of different perspectives on different ways of looking at stuff. So that's what I wanted to say about that. Oh, and then here's another technique we didn't get into. Drugs.
Yep. That's where we're going next.
Yeah. Sorry, I have one last intellectual tool that I think that people can try out, which is when you're thinking about how you want culture to be, or society rather, social organism to be organized, try to think about it anatomically. I don't mean, arousal, although go ahead and do that too. We can get into the libidinal economy if you want to, and horny activism. But I mean, try to think about it anatomically in the sense that, our anatomy works on different principles in our body. What is good for the heart and the brain and the gut. Sure, there are things that tend to all of them, but they're all sort of governed by different kinds of laws. So it is in our culture. Our cultural and spiritual life is informed by different laws and practices and conversations than our economics life and our political life. And the more that we separate these things out from each other and begin to understand those conversations separately, we need to do that work and then start bringing them back together in a kind of bridging. But we can't have them all blended together, because right now we have economics and the state doing this sort of push and pull where the cultural, spiritual stuff is a casualty of that.
Yes.
And I think, it's really good to sort of pull them apart. What is the appropriate conversation in economics, completely divorced from rights, completely divorced from cultural, spiritual stuff? It sounds like bonkers, but why would we want anybody to do that? It's because it needs to be purified, And the same thing with rights and politics, and the same thing with culture. And then these conversations can start happening. So just do that exercise. Pick some aspect of society. I think the easiest one, I was doing this with people in my sermons, is like, do flying on planes. What are the spiritual aspects? Just leave everything else out. What are the rights aspects, leaving everything else out, and what are the economic aspects, leaving everything else out. Now, how can we get these people to talk to each other? So that's a little more complicated, and I'd have to go into it a lot more, but I think just doing that exercise is useful.
Yeah, it's good. It's funny when, for want of a better term, the spiritual or even just like philosophical or meaning-based aspects of life are sidelined, as if they're kind of irrelevant in an empirical model. That's actually a philosophical or metaphysical position, right? Like you can't not do it, which is what's so frustrating for me dealing with, again, like failures of left critique. It's like it is a metaphysics to say that you can separate metaphysics from politics. And that's kind of where I want to, and same thing with medicine, right? Like that is a bullshit metaphysics. And one of the things that I think makes this just the strangest fucking timeline is the little Indian kid who invented email is like running for Senate against Elizabeth Warren in Massachusetts on like a mugger ticket. And what's even more fascinating to me about Dr. Shiva is that he's like the grandson of a witch. When he tells his stories about growing up back in, like, his grandmother could read people's faces, and it's where the origins of his kind of systems approach, which is still too technical for my liking, to medicine come from. But he made a comment that stuck with me, which is like Western medicine is a battlefield model where you kind of like patch up the injured person, and then he wouldn't say this, but I would, like, and then make them toddle off and do more capitalism, right? So it doesn't actually have, you just kind of like bandage something and send them back into a system that keeps shooting at them. And when we come to what does this challenge look like from a more coherent system, like an indigenous shamanic approach or whatever it happens to be, right? All of that stuff falls away, and I will be damned if, and this is my most dismaying disappointment in where all this discussion has gone. It leaps to a bunch of dangerous assumptions that will just wreck everyone's lives, which is not only is this the right approach to be taking, but like this is the cosmology that gives us this right approach is itself the right approach. And in the meantime, you have, and it comes back to the drugs thing, right? It's like, nowhere else in the world, and I include our quote unquote our own system going back 300 years and then forever backwards, do we dissociate being in a state of disease from meaning? Because as Danny mentioned very early on, there is an interiority to illness that is effectively why it's there, but also the key to like returning to wellness. And it doesn't matter what system you're in, you're dealing, and you cannot divorce a state of being in dis-ease out of ease with its personal and cosmic significance and a return to wholeness in a wider context. And I think that is the bit that I talk about it from a magical community perspective. Since this has begun, I'm like, I swear most of these people are just fucking playing. They're just here as a fucking hobby, because as soon as magic is required, they fucking melt. They fucking melt and just turn into scared Americans. And it's really disappointing. I'm like, get a better hobby. Like literally any other hobby is a better use of your time. Because now when magic is more required and more urgent, you just abandon it. And it has the key. Like that is our, like again, quote unquote, our blah, blah, blah. That is our version of how we cohere meaning and relation and illness and wholeness. That's like how we do it. What's going on here? Thoughts?
When it comes back to the quantification of everything, and if significance is statistical for you, that's a terrible, terrible poverty to be in, I think. And yeah, it's about meaning, and we have fragmented meaning in a big way. It's a cliche to say it, but you know, I've been really ill. I did a podcast with you. I think I was going off about that. And being really ill is a really good opportunity to look at what's meaningful, you know, especially if you're treating it with magic. Yeah, I mean, something else just comes to mind as well. I like the battlefield medicine thing. In Vedic medicine, you've got to sleep. You've really got to sleep. And I think that's another thing which you know, both on the personal level, how do you respond to COVID if you get it? First thing, I slept for 2 nights in a row for about 11 hours, which I never do. Like I never sleep, and I'm 90% sure I had it because my whole family had different symptoms. But yeah, just stop, stop for a bit, and also on a collective level.
Yeah.
Stop, think what you're doing.
Yeah, the sleep bit's so important. So a whole bunch of premium members are getting to the end of a 3-day fast. I'm going to kick on for a few more days, but your sleep pattern, your dreams change when you're in a fast, and you are in a state of healing. Like you're literally in a state of autophagy, and the dreams. Like I insisted everyone they should do it anyway, but like keep a dream journal through the process, because sleep is not just healing, but it's also an interface with it is the interface with the imaginal, and it's where you get the kind of like opportunity to engage in meaning and interact with it multidimensionally, and it's just, this is all not there anymore. In fact, we put people in comas and shove robots down their throat that explode their lungs. What the fuck? Yeah. Connor?
Just on another point, just while we're just
Connor,
I just want to jump in very quickly, if I may, and it's a completely unrelated point, but just there's all these book titles popping into my head, and I'm sure there are for other people. So I'm wondering if we're thinking about particular techniques and particular authors and particular things we should be reading or thinking about. I wonder if the people watching might want to throw them into the web chat so we can have a record of what people think are particularly relevant writers and thinkers for this moment.
I've been keeping half an eye on it. You've triggered a Bob Wilson book club, so that's a start.
Cool, happy about that.
Yeah. Magic and magical healing modalities, Connor. Anything you want to add?
Yeah. Yeah, I hope I can sort of lead through this complicated point, which was brought up best in a very sort of complicated and dense book that I would nevertheless recommend to people who are willing to take it on, which is called Illness and Healing in the Gospels by Judith Von Hall, where she points out that, in the Bible, people went to the pool of Bethesda, and they would travel from miles around to, heal themselves. Right. And this pool at the time was a place where people washed their animals, would wash themselves, would dump wastewater in and all this kind of stuff. But there was some bubbling up in the pool that is attributed at that time. The hands of an angel troubled the waters of the pool of Bethesda. Okay. Yes. Now, what she points out, which is really profound, is that if, you had scientists right now, like, look at that water, they would say that water is disgusting and dirty, and how could it heal anybody? People would just get bacteria from it. Well, obviously the people that traveled there for miles and miles and miles to go bathe in that pool and be healed were not stupid. They didn't go on these pilgrimages to go in this water and be healed and like, well, actually it was a thermal vent, not an angel, and they were just idiots and whatever. Like, this is just not, it had healing properties. Yep. But if you went there now, you would get sick. And it's not because of the power of suggestion that you would have not gotten sick then, but you would get sick now, but rather the entire field of what constitutes health and healing has a deep relationship to the understanding of what health and healing is. We can understand this in our own ways, right? So we can understand this in terms of, until you have a concept of the immune system, which is a completely arbitrary concept, it's a gathering of certain features of the human anatomy that have been observed into a way that make them understandable. We don't have such thing as autoimmune disease. So the pace of disease and anatomy and our understandings of them keep up and a pace with each other through time. But that doesn't just mean, oh, this is just an understanding. It means actually that the face of health and healing changes over time.
Yes, absolutely.
Right? So ontologically different. It's not just a change in the information or the knowing, it's ontological difference. So the thing that we need to understand is not just the ways in which we, and I'm sure, Danny's has given whole talks about this, so I'm sort of a bit of an amateur describing this in a way that, but I think it's like, it's not just what we understand, it's also what we contribute to in the pool of health and healing when it comes to our own actions, our words, our thoughts. And the introduction into the social organism of disease deepens the commitment of the social organism to that model of disease, which deepens our relationship to it as disease. So we need to do work that allows us to disentangle ourselves from the labyrinth of certain kinds of dimensional language.
Yep.
This is not advice to anybody at all. But when I was diagnosed with lymphoma, I said to the doctors, and this was years ago, no, sorry. And that was it.
Yeah.
And I was fucking scared shitless for a year and a half, but I didn't go back and I didn't get checked again. And I just thought, I'm not entering into the labyrinth of your fucking language. I had too much on my plate. I was in the hospital for something completely unrelated. My boyfriend at the time had assaulted me. So I was just like, I can't deal with another fucking thing. And I think you guys are fucking crazy, right? And like also, you know, my friend Lynn Margulies, who's one of the smartest people in the entire world, who was my mentor, she said, you know what they do? You know what you do when they tell you you have cancer? And I said, what? She said, nothing. And I said, okay, good. Thank you, Lynn. So the idea is when you, and she was a completely scientific thinker. I mean, she's a very spiritual person, but her outward facing life was scientific. When you enter into certain labyrinths, they're very fucking hard to get out of. But more than that, you contribute to the densification of the labyrinth for everybody else, right? Yeah. So we need to be able to move into new ways of thinking that actually heal everybody when we start to do this. So here's a very simple tool. Pray. It's so simple. Pray and talk to the dead. And my God, Gordon, every single time we talk, I say, talk to the dead. Right? So now I'll say pray, which is also talking to the dead. If you're praying to Jesus or if you're praying to, like, you know, these other beings or whatever, pray. Like, start to engage in a different relationship with the dissolution of the kinds of materialistic pathways that we take in our life all the time, which make it so much harder for people to break out of them. In an individual sense, that does something. I have 20 more things to say, but I'm going to stop right now because I know you
like the ontological difference is critical. I've been relying, as I have been for the last few years, on like Charles Fort's dominant approach, where things actually become true. It's not like the Kuhnian approach where we learn more and it gets, because that's not correct. Things definitively become true. And why I think, and it comes back to what I think is going underneath the earlier parts of the discussion where we said, I think this overreach, this technocratic overreach is the thing that ultimately makes that narrative fail. And it's happening so, such a fascinating way with medicine. And it's a real Steinerite angle, right? So the whole shebang relies on germ theory being 100% correct. And it's just so amazing to me that the discourse that is, the counter discourse that has emerged around it, like it's terrain versus germ theory is returned. Now, I happen to be 65-35 terrain germ. I don't understand why you'd need to pick one. Like, pathogens exist, right? But terrain theory has been sneaking back in our idea of holistic medicine and the microbiome and so on, rather than the one virus, one vaccine machine, like battlefield model, right? And what you're saying there is so crucially important that if that's again, you know what I mean? That's a position that's available to people in quote unquote Western culture, that like terrain theory and the cosmologies around it are actually valid. Like you can make a good case for it. And it's one of the things I view it as a co-present symptom for a change in how we understand health that's actually happening in our world. And this is, I think our understanding of health is returning to a state of health, is returning to what it looks like in the rest of the world. And I think this is the process that does it, because by the end of it, we will look at the numbers and there will be bullshit. We will look at the RNA altering injectable that they're calling a vaccine that kills a bunch of people who line up for it. And we will look at this whole thing and the implementation of state power and go, this was shit. already the testing and the counting is fucked. And that doesn't even matter. It's actually the whole cosmology is doing its best to demonstrate its perfection and failing. And that's what I see going on. I don't know about anyone else.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good moment for us to create our own cosmologies and to be really adamant about them as well. You know, just as Connor says, you know, if you get diagnosed with something, no, I'm not doing that. You know, and the metaphor of the labyrinth is interesting. You know, how do you get out of a labyrinth? Well, when you go in, you have a ball of wool, so you know the paths that you've come down, so you can find your way out. You know, it takes a lot of unpicking if you're in a labyrinth. However, if you take to your labyrinth a whole load of, if you've already looked into, let's say, for example, the sociology of scientific knowledge, and you've already got a good solid critique of it, and if you haven't, I've just released a book on it. And if you also take, what was I going to say? I got lost in my plug there for a second. Yeah, so when I got ill, for example, the curandero, the for want of a better word, shaman who's looking after me.
Jump in there before you tell the story. People don't, maybe if they don't realize, Danny got leishmaniasis you're in Brazil, right? And cured it with ayahuasca.
Yeah, so I went to the curandero there and showed him my wound. I had an open wound on my chest, and back to kind of protozoal colony. And the guy there said, "Oh no, you can't treat this with ayahuasca. You need to treat that. You need to go to the hospital." And I went, "Well, you know, I've come all the way to this country to learn about ayahuasca and about your medical traditions." And he said, no. And I said, "Well, I heard your father was a great healer." And he said, "Okay then." But the first thing he said to me was he said, "Okay, well, if you're gonna do this with me," and he did this. He covered his ears and he sung a line from the song of from one of the songs of my tradition, which says basically, follow your path and let other people say what they want. And he advised me not to get into conversations with people who weren't down with what I was doing. And it was the whole time. So I was living in quite a small community, just in the Amazon, but on the edge of the city in the Amazon. And it's pretty medicalized. Brazil is seriously medicalized anyway. And the only thing people wanted to talk to me about was, have you had your injections yet? Have you had your injections yet? And I got really quite reclusive and occasionally aggressive towards people who do that, because you really can't buy into other people's cosmology. And actually, it reminds me of this line from it's a story. It's actually quite a modern story. It's a Jewish story, and I'm going to get some of the details wrong here. But a guy goes to his rabbi with a lung complaint, and he says, "Look, there's some really good medics in Switzerland who know how to treat this, and also." But I could stay here in Israel, right? And what should I do? And the rabbi said, "You should stay here in Israel." Why? And the reason was because there are different, let's say, regions of the Jewish world, and the top rabbis in them have slightly different opinions on. And he goes back to a particular line in the Talmud where they're talking about whether an animal with a damaged lung is kosher or not. And the two. Basically the territory covered by Switzerland, the rabbi has said it's not kosher, and the territory covered by Israel, so it's an Ashkenazi and Sephardi thing, is kosher. So if you're here, the Torah is such a way that you're fine. But if you go there, well, then you're in trouble because it's not kosher anymore. And this is, that's kind of the way they see. They see kind of reality, let's say, filter through the words of this tradition and the Torah, and including the oral Torah and all the commentary on it. And actually creating reality. And I think we do that linguistically on various levels. And the better we get with our linguistics, and the better we get at using different languages, the more artillery we can bring. No, I don't like the battle metaphor. The more medicine we can bring into a more meaningful medicine we can bring.
Yeah, my healing story isn't. So you've done lymphoma. Danny's done leishmaniasis. Mine is like curing severe depression and banishing it permanently, and have for years with entheogens. But it's a model difference. Mine's accepted now, but it was kind of a bit on the edge to begin with. You guys are a bit more impressive, but it's the same, like, no. The whole framing of how this is done, because it's not just the brain or it's not just the electrochemical interruptions in the brain that do it for me. Like psilocybin allows me to work through the past components that are activated in a depressive episode. So like there's stuff outside of an RNA altering injectable available to us. There's the whole living universe.
Yeah, and I just want to say, like, for all our stories, to everybody that's listening, I mean, I know you prefaced your episode, one of your episodes with Danny, like, none of this is medical advice and all that kind of stuff. And, but one of the reasons why it's important to say that, other than just the sort of legal disclaimer, is that, again, everybody that's listening to this is stuck in a certain kind of ontology. So it's very hard to just sort of walk out of that. So on the one hand, I want to tell everybody, do what you think you need to do for your own health, right? But in another way, it's so densified that it's like walking through a wall. So it takes a certain amount of either desperation or sort of spiritual fortitude, spiritual practice, or maybe a key in some ways that somebody gives to you to be able to do certain things with your health and your body. And I didn't even know I was doing it until it was done. And I had sex with a guy who was like the lymphoma expert of the world. And he's like, oh, you self-cured. He's like, we see that all the time. And I was like, what the fuck are you talking? What? You know? And so I just want to say, like, it's not available to everybody. This is also why, by the way, like, the whole anti-vax argument is completely dumb in its own way, because it's taking place in the ontology, in the densified ontology of the vaccination world. So it doesn't really shift anything or move anything. And people will indeed still get sick from the things that the anti-vaxxers are railing against. And it's a reinforcement of that world. So it's like, in some ways, it just doesn't, I mean, I'm never going to have kids. I just don't, like, I don't even think about vaccines as like an issue in my life, but I do sort of look upon that. I'm like, well, like, you guys, what you're doing isn't really going to work or have any sort of efficacy at all, because people have already contributed so deeply to this ontology, this world, and this dimension of language, and something else is called upon. And, again, I have so much more to say, but I know also we have to do Q&A and all that kind of stuff. And so I don't want to, I've already taken up a lot of time. Yeah.
Now that's cool. Is there anything you want to say, Danny, before I jump to the questions?
Only that I'm very proud of the fact that I got a disclaimer on your show, whereas you get a whole load of Satanists and they don't get a disclaimer. I think
that's true. That's true. I think there's only been a couple work on this as in medical advice, but Connor's right. I probably should have put it at the front of this one. But I think we'll be further down the queue of people being prosecuted for practicing false medicine at the moment. So I'm sure we'll be all right. So first question from Shannon: is there a potential power of 8 or intention effect dynamic at work, as in the existence of a mass media machine more readily makes people have the same thoughts at the same time, with that accelerated under lockdown, creating a kind of reality warping effect, perhaps explaining some credulity? Like, yes, I'm going to jump in there first and say it's two things, and I'll do the conspiratorial one first. Mind control is absolutely in play at the moment from a technology perspective, and I mean that technologically. I don't just mean that cosmologically, where different repeated words and phrases and so on, that's a technology go on. So on the one hand, there is actual mind control technology in play, but that is almost irrelevant to your other question, which is, yes, absolutely. We have about 125 years of parapsychological data that shows that, like, thoughts individually and collectively influence outcomes in like local space-time. So if you make the entire planet scared, it's not good. And it also necessarily suggests the urgency of a non-fear-based response. But absolutely. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like, there's direct mind control stuff going on. And I also think that just implicit in digital technology is a mind control mechanism that is not necessarily intended by most people working in this field, but they just don't realize it. Maybe some people sort of higher up or whatever. But when you have Wi-Fi, and when you have 2, 3, 4, and now coming to you soon, everywhere, 5G, I mean, I think you need to understand that this inhalation and exhalation of this technology, which is seeking to come to life in its own way, or anti-life in its own way, has real problems. So I was saying this before, but, like, the tech itself, because it works on wave technology. So like when you have, just to explain very quickly, like the lesser sort of G forms, they use longer waves. So they're discontinuous, but they're longer forms. So the higher up you get, the shorter the wave is. So in other words, we're cutting down the continuity with each successive version of 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G. So it becomes more and more smaller bits of information that are strung together much more quickly, right? And so the tech works in creating discontinuity. It works by creating an illusion of continuity through rapid discontinuity, right? So the signal itself is influencing the way we think. That's why we have fragmented thinking. That's a big part of it. That's why it's so hard to pay attention to anything without looking at your phone. It's why we have art that is just jump cut after jump cut after jump cut after jump cut. It's hard to hold a single thought. All these things were difficult to begin with, but as we start limiting and limiting and limiting, the medium itself is giving us fragmented, discontinuous stimuli constantly. It's like closing your eyes, opening your eyes, closing your eyes, opening your eyes constantly. So it's blotting out your consciousness at this sort of like rapid wave. So that is a form of mind control as well. And again, most people working in Silicon Valley and all that, they don't know that. They don't think about that because they don't have a spiritual worldview, but it's filtering down to us every second of the day.
Danny?
Yeah.
I think so. Yeah, I mean, I remember being at Spiritualist Church once and asking why they don't have any ectoplasm anymore, and he said, "Oh, it's because of all the electromagnetic radiation." And as that kind of you know, as the environment of that changes, things definitely change. I'm going to come at that question from a slightly different perspective. Yeah, reality warping. Again, it sounds cliche to do it, but we all kind of create aspects of our reality as we do it, and on a mass level, and particularly interesting in symptomology. And you see this a lot with you know, different pains, especially kind of pains that are moving around the body. They can kind of move according to what's going on in people's lives. And I'm reminded of something actually from that book I recommended earlier, Ethan Waters' book. And he's talking about the response to PTSD in Southeast Asia. And it was basically a load of doctors and a load of psychotherapists rocking up, you know, Pfizer-sponsored conferences and that kind of thing. One of the things that was really interesting was, I think it was in Sri Lanka, if I remember correctly, that one of the symptoms of well, this is what happened. So people were taken off to these camps, kind of you know, emergency camps, and a couple of days later they were saying, no, we need to go back to our families now. We need to go back to workplaces. And the response was, no, you can't do that. You need to process this trauma yourselves, in yourselves, which is where we locate the trauma. And they were saying, no, the problem isn't me. The problem is in the relationship between me and my people, you know. So I need to get back to my people in order to fix that. But part of the symptomology which turned up in these people was joint pain, which is not a normal PTSD symptom.
Mm-hmm.
And when I say normal PTSD symptom, PTSD is younger than me. You know, I'm 43. I think it's about 41. And it's not the same as shell shock. It's different. The symptomology is different. But this idea of the fact that the joint pain, i.e. the bit which connects different limbs together, was the site of the pain, is I think really, really interesting. And when we look at like pandemics, for example, we look at big diseases which kick off, we want to look at the underlying cosmologies and shared cosmologies that are certainly pushing the, I wouldn't say totally responsible for how they emerge or how they present, but certainly pushing the symptoms in a certain direction. So yeah, I would say the mass media, particularly this kind of drawing out of meaning, So we're not even, you know, you're almost kind of considered foolish for trying to, you know, come back to what Connor says, for trying to make some kind of coherence between the bits of data. You know, you almost sound like you're a caveman or something right from the beginning. I wonder if the other side of that is if I'm ever hopeful that the kind of banality of it, you know, we've got this incredible technology and what are most people doing with it, you know, just checking out celebrities and things like that. I wonder if the banality of it will be its own demise, you know, and if people will almost will need to seek something that's more coherent.
Mm. I like that.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, that's good. Next one from Joe. Skipping a not necessarily personal one. So how do we get our allies to see that we're not in a war? We're on a rescue mission. I think being patiently available. One is to lead by example and actually just do it. One of the things I find interesting about if this is an assault on all living, an assault on all living is the right term for it. So birthday parties and funerals and national parks and sex and hugging, like it's an assault on all living, and it kills people as well. Like, let's not ignore that bit. Then it's actually just opened up every single. If you want an infinite battlefield or infinite fronts in the one war, then you've got it. Like, there are more of us. So there are more of us who want to move into like a more caring, the better world our hearts know is possible, to, use Charles Eisenstein's term for it. So you have to do it by example. And I know this is hard at the moment. You just have to let people vomit their shadow up all over social media, and you and whoever else it is, and just patiently be waiting when, and it will occur to them, there must be and there needs to be better ways of being in the world, is how I do it. This is a hill to die on. No one has ever been convinced of anything in an argument. You just don't, there's like no point. You can't actually you can't argue someone. You can defeat them in a stand-up row, but that's not the same as convincing them of something. And that's literally the only way it's ever been done. Do as I do. It's in the book.
Yeah, I agree completely. I second all that. And just to take a kind of metaphor from therapy is to not hold other people's shit. Classic example, someone comes to a therapist, my wife's a nightmare. They've probably been telling that story all over the place. And the normal response is, oh God, that must be terrible for you. Isn't it a shame? And often it'll end up with, oh yeah, she sounds terrible. Well, what are you saying about my wife? There's that kind of, so not really being, holding it, holding the, I hate this term, holding the space, but not holding the turd that you're given. Okay, I'm here to listen to you. I'm going to listen to you very compassionately, but this is your turd and you can eat it and you can digest it.
Anything, Connor?
Well, I think just realizing that you're not alone, even if you're sitting in a room by yourself, it's like, you don't have to go to everybody with your conflicts. You can take them to the spiritual world, again, through prayer or simply speaking out loud to the dead or doing work with other spiritual beings, and sort of engaging with the world in that way. I mean, I think it's like the urge to show everybody it's not a war is, a war urge, So you use your friends, that aren't at war with you to talk to about it, because you got to diffuse that energy somehow too. I mean, I just sense in the question that there's also a striking out even in asking that question, not to scold whoever asked it. It's a great question, but just remember that you're as responsible, for that stance. I mean, I certainly the fuck am, so yeah.
From Jamie on the question of where to send libido, what sigils do we send our libido to right now? I think that would be an individualized one. Tactically at the moment, it's kind of the same as the previous question. Whatever you can do to participate in local flourishing and local mutual aid, there are real quick wins, and they're actually emerging. Like the people are taking seriously where they get their food from and all kinds of really exciting stuff. So let it flow locally to begin with. Don't, however horny you may be, don't fight the empire with your libido. I mean, you can, but like not in a frontal assault.
Not in a full frontal assault. I think that I think also I just want to say, like, look, what a lot of people are doing right now is the shattering of their view of capitalism and all these kinds of blah 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 leftist shit. Like they're just like, holy shit, like work sucks. Why am I going to a separate horrible building all the time? Oh, the government really doesn't care about me. Oh, the government's letting people die. Oh, I don't have any money, all that kind of stuff. For a lot of us here who are listening, we all knew all of that already, right? So you might actually start noticing that you are playing into different grinding machines, right? For me, honestly, like I have been involved in sexual activity my entire life. So for 3 months almost now, I've had one blowjob, so still got some, but I've just rather frustrated with all of that. Now, I'm not saying that it's better to be celibate. I certainly would never say this. It was better to be celibate than to be promiscuous. I would never say that. But I noticed the way in which the patterns in my life are feeding certain kinds of cycles of expectation that are unavailable to me right now. Or I notice the impulse to be involved in certain other things that are not available to me right now. So because I've already left, in my mind, a lot of the damaging shit that I would have invested my libido in if I were just sort of waking up to capitalism right now, I can see all the other places that it's going, and that is nonstop, whether they're good or bad for me or not. I now have a chance to observe them. So I would just pay attention to that and maybe not say that your libido has to go into anything other than the reinvestigation of where you think your libido is supposed to go, and not to stop it and not to shame yourself or create a block in pleasure, but just because this might be the only opportunity you ever fucking have to do that. So just do it.
Yeah, I think coming at it from yeah, I mean, I'm going to say pretty much the same. In fact, I'm going to quote the Gospel of Thomas. Don't lie and don't do what you hate.
Yeah,
that would be what I'd suggest.
Yeah.
And then I'd probably stick Crowley on the end of that as well. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law, and not too much larger than that. It's just there's this. I'm not just talking about sex. I'm talking about all our transformational desires. Just if you find yourself in the queue of McDonald's, don't be mean to yourself, but think that shit through, basically.
Yeah.
Unless you really love it, unless it's
sure.
your very true will to get your hamburger.
Yeah. I'm going to knock 3 that are interrelated off with 1 or 2 sentences. Do I still stand by the Blue Shield EMF protectors? I used them for a couple of years and I didn't replace them, but I'm in a quieter EMF environment down here. Worth being said, the guy who I got the recommendation from doesn't use them anymore anyway. But anecdotally, they're quite good. And related, what do we do in response to 5G and EMF overdosing? And there was another one that was related to that. Basically, it depends on where you are. Like I have a whole section in the premium member section. You just have to commit to being in a ray gun fight for the rest of your life. Like it depends on your context and your reactivity. And this kind of comes back to why I like terrain theory, where 5G doesn't cause carunca, right? But your immune system, which again is a novel idea, speaking of novel viruses, is impacted by your environment, is impacted by terrain, right? So obviously your EMF surroundings are unique to you and need to be mitigated in ways that are unique to you. And it's about that kind of health and robustness. So there aren't specific things like buy this device and put it in your house and you're safe from 5G. Like it doesn't necessarily work like that. It is a thing you need to learn. It is a thing that you will not be told the correct, the official opinion is wrong, and it is wrong because it is rolling out an Internet of Things. And even I'm not prepared to take that risk that this one time, the predatory class is actually telling us, no, this is fine. Put a microwave tower next to your house. So it depends where you are, but you're like the correct answer is you need to your own satisfaction, have an understanding of what you think is going on and what your EMF response is. Anyone else?
Yeah. I've quite a bit of a response, actually. So, okay, so like there are so many reasons to stop 5G from happening. We're going to be confronted. I mean, it's already happening, but we're going to be confronted by it more and more, like those 30,000 satellites that Elon Musk wants to put up. Plus, there, Amazon and Virgin and all these other and governments, world governments, are interested in putting their own satellites up as well. And so we're all going to be confronted with this, right? So there are a lot of things that we need to do, not just to take care of ourselves, but to take care of each other and to take care of the world. Now, ourselves is the baseline, because we can't help, like, you got to put your own mask on for your own mask on first if the plane's going down. But one is that we can try to just stop those satellites from going up, right? And there are actually tactics for doing that, where you can hustle the things that are already in place. It takes a lot of rocket fuel and a lot of emissions to send stuff up into space and put satellites up there, right? Tons and tons of black carbon is emitted from doing that. So you can play on the sympathies of the environmentalist movement to utilize it against this kind of stuff, right? That's one way that I would think about doing it. You can, if they get all those up there and they start installing mini bases and small cell bases around your city or wherever you are, you could destroy those. Maybe if you wanted to do that. I'm not recommending that because that's against the law. But if you thought about that, that might be something that some people could do to take, because what the satellites have to do is beam down to these smaller cells that will be concentrated in urban areas. You could say that wild areas should have no coverage. That can be a stance that you take in activism as well, that I think actually would be tactically easy to drum up. You can create counter devices, some of what Gordon's talking about, but also devices that rely on different frequencies of hertz and all that kind of stuff. Orgone technology is really useful here, because the way that works is when waves come into it, it breaks up their normal pattern of being able to sort of go through an object. And that's how it works, by having these different layers of materials. So you can think about that. And you can, most importantly, I think, for the self, is counteract it with metamorphic thinking. In other words, continuous thinking, because I was talking about the discontinuity that happens before. Really fucking simple ways to do that. Play an instrument, sing, draw, do things that have a continuous motion in your life rather than discontinuous, that are not mediated by devices, so you can strengthen yourself inwardly to be able to confront the fragmentation that's going to happen. I don't know where Gordon went.
Yeah, the camera switched off. Danny, what do you want to say? I'll try and switch cameras.
Just very briefly, and I'd agree with all that. I'm just trying to remember exactly the history of how the safety limits of microwave radiation were set. And if I remember correctly, what they did was they worked out how much microwave radiation was required to heat up a piece of meat by 1 degree, and then it was divided by 10 or divided by 100. I'm going to try. I was just having a look at it here. I couldn't find it on the internet, but it's it's good to come to those arguments, especially around 5G. And this isn't a magical response. This is how you deal with people when you get into that particular argument. It's good to come to those arguments with some data, with some history on where it's coming from.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's one that. Yeah, I like this one actually, because we're getting towards the end. From Brian, it feels like Christianity isn't buckling down on the apocalypse. Are there new Christian thoughts that are asking to be brought back? Well, I can't imagine more Gnostic times. So for me, it's looking at the multiple Christianities. I think it's actually deriving nourishment and thinking. There goes the camera again. It's the battery is exhausted on it, but I'm still here. I think it's that. I think for me, it's not necessarily becoming Gnostic, because I'm not. It's looking at the wisdom from multiple Christianities, particularly in the ones that emerged, which they all did in a context of a collapsing empire. There's a lot in that. I don't think. I think we can leave it to the sort of the wilder parts of red states to worry more about a specific apocalypse. I think there's some really good stuff about how we navigate towards spirituality in a dangerous and artificial time. That would be my answer. Anyone else?
Christian, I mean, the apocalypse
Sorry.
is okay. I'll go with this one. Yeah, the apocalypse. I mean, there's two ways of looking at the apocalypse, and one of them's with the etymology of the word, and as I'm sure everyone's aware, it's revelation, revealing, the lifting of a curtain. And I mean, I found around here there was a couple of days after COVID hit here, there was old school evangelical Christians dropping things through my box. Oh, it's gone green. But there are, you know, as well as the Gnostic forms, which I'm very, which I think were fantastic, especially for this moment. Santo Daime, which is my lineage, is a Christian and entheogenic lineage, and that's quite interesting stuff. So I think that's definitely stepping up. That's expanding, and has, I mean, it's very, very pagan Christianity. It comes from the Brazilian Amazon, and underneath all of it is a love for nature and it's quite Gnostic in its way. You know, it talks a lot about the illusion and retreating from the illusion, getting away from the illusion. It's never exactly clear what the illusion is, but people have got their own ideas on that. But yeah, I think there are forms of new school Christianity, particularly in the entheogenic world, which can help out there. Oh, cool.
I got sick of this conversation, so I went into space. Sorry, I'm on my laptop. I'm on my laptop camera.
Had an AEX 1724 whatever. I mean, I'm going to say something rather controversial, which will piss everybody off, and I don't mean to say it to undermine what Danny said at all, because I agree with everything he said, but I'm going to say with a kind of deep certainty. I'm a Christian, right? I was raised with no religion and came to Christianity as a revelation to me through cult practice and will and thinking and feeling. And I mean, I think that anthroposophy is the way to truly be Christian. I don't mean that there are no other Christianities that are valuable or that you can learn from or really get something from. But when we talk about the practice of being Christian, I do think that anthroposophy is the sort of headquarters of that. There's one other stream that I think is sort of the same thing, which is you know, really you can look into a guy named Daskalos who has a lot to do with health and healing, and that will lead you there as well. So Rudolf Steiner and Daskalos, one is a reincarnated Aristotelian stream and one is a reincarnated Platonic stream. And those two are finally meeting each other in this era, which is very good news for us. But I would just look into those if I were you. Nice one. All right. So I hope this webinar has a bibliography. So there's a question from Greystone. How do we work magically / ontologically towards good health while also needing to function, i.e. wearing masks, taking vaccines, etc.? The popular ontology and medical understanding, is that impossible? It's challenging, but like, again, so Danny's Jewish, Connor and I are gay. Connor's also Malaysian or whatever it is, I forget. This comes back to the understanding of history and biology and medicine. Like, it's always been challenging. There's always been what the state wants to do to one's bodies, particularly the bodies of subalterns, and what should be done with subalterns' bodies. So there isn't a universal to it, but I think, kind of coming back to, in a weird way, what Connor was saying about people waking up to what capitalism actually requires to function at the moment. The same thing is happening with, like, this is what it's been like for sex workers and Indian women and all the rest. This is what it's been like. Now it's happening to you. and there's a kind of weird sense of, this is a shameful thing to admit, but in a way I'm glad. In a way I'm glad it's now happening to everyone. So as a, and I wish it wasn't happening to anyone, but I wish it didn't happen to anyone. This was my whole point with the blog post last week or whatever it was. The body is a battlefield for the state. So how we navigate it is how we've always done it. And I kind of
joke, but it's true. I say coven rules apply. Like you have your own, you have to navigate it and dodge the policeman, however it is. And I think about that. I don't know. I don't want to call it a vaccine, but I think about what you will, by then we'll hopefully know what kind of opportunities to remediate it if it is mandatory and all the rest of it. But like it's always been this game. It has always been the state impacting bodies, right? And this is just what it looks like now. So I guess my main bit of advice is to step into that current of history and realize that you have had ancestors, and I certainly have, we all have, that have been destroyed by this process, and they're waiting with their insight.
And you were destroyed by this process at some point, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. And also, just to bring up sex workers, it's like here's a great thing. Like, if you're worried about a surveillance state, you know who might be good to talk to about how to dodge the law and form underground networks of communication that are somehow under the radar to be able to do something that's illegal, but nevertheless necessary and has a kind of intimate connection? You might want to talk to sex workers about their strategies and so on and so forth. There are lots of people who have been strategizing for a long time to deal with these things. And it's also why I object to people with this asshole fucking, this is where I'll get pissed off, Gordon, this asshole like, well, but you're in a position of privilege when you're saying these things. Or you're social, like your isolation is a privilege and your blah, blah, blah is a fucking privilege. It's just like, okay, so are you actually telling me that the people who are the most marginalized and oppressed are the ones that come up with the best tactics and strategies? So fuck you for saying that they're not able to come up with that. As someone who's been in these marginalized communities in one way or another that have been under some kind of threat at some point, I know that the strategies brew in the margins. So stop talking to me about the privilege of someone who is like speaking out. Like, actually the people that are oppressed will be the ones that we should be turning to for fucking help.
Yeah, look to your drug dealer for help. They know what they're doing.
Exactly.
Agreed. Absolutely. This is that algorithm thing, right? I think it's always happened, but now where it has been fortune tellers and sex workers and drug dealers, now it's also hairdressers and accountants, and like, good, you know.
Yeah, I think, you know, the question, how do you work magically ontologically towards good health quickly, I think would be the answer there, because there might be a real fucking pandemic not too far away, and some you know, something really nasty could be coming. I think something is very likely to be coming. There's all kinds of very old viruses waking up from the melting permafrost, just to give one example of the health threats that we're facing. So yeah, quickly.
Well, this seems like a good time to give like last advice and where to find you and final words and so on. We've done, this has been fucking great, and the chat has been a firecracker. Whenever I do these, I'm always jealous of the people in the chat, because I'm like, that sounds fun too. But yeah, so like last words or thoughts to leave people on, and where they can go if they want to like follow up on some of the things that you've been discussing or what you got going on, that kind of thing.
Yeah, go ahead. No, you go.
All right, okay, I'll go. So I mean, it also answers Mark's question as well, specific to the psychedelic regimen. Gordon's on Rune Soup, there's two chats with me where you can check me out there. I've also got this book here, which is Science Revealed.
Yes.
That's just out again, new edition. And then I've got this book here, which is Neuroapocalypse. I'm not going to tell you what they're about. Get on the internet and have a look. And where else? Psychedelic Press. You can find me on Psychedelic Press. You can find me on Twitter at Rev, R-E-V, Nemu, N-E-M-U. And then there's a website, which is the Reverend, no, it isn't. It's nemusend.co.uk, but it's fairly neglected. But you can check me out there as well. Oh, I forgot about last advice. Just be nice to each other.
That's good.
So Okay, so easy enough to find at Connor Habib on Twitter, where you can find me talking about the occult, showing off my butt, or telling somebody they're an idiot. Also, patreon.com/Connor Habib. That directly supports what I'm doing, and I know actually a lot of the people that are here are a part of that already, but if you're not, you can think about it. I want to give advice, something that
You should mention you have like an All Right podcast too.
Oh yeah, I have a podcast called Against Everyone with Connor Habib, and it's a pretty great podcast. Probably the best podcast of anybody.
It's on a list of podcasts.
Yeah. It's like, yeah. I mean, I'm sort of like a good, like, like there might be like a Joe Biden kind of podcast in the room right now with us, and then there's also like anyway. So I would say the something that I've noticed that people are really having difficulty with is like we're giving all this advice, but then people are having like trouble focusing, trouble keeping their minds and stuff. And I had mentioned metamorphic thinking before and just doing stuff that's not related to devices. But if you find yourself sitting down to read and you can't read, if you find yourself sitting down to meditate and you can't because your brain is going in so many different places, because that's one of the illnesses of our moment. Here's a simple exercise that I was revealed to me, or I invented, or what, I don't know what the fuck, but like it works really well, is that you imagine the numbers 1 through 10. So you imagine the number 1, and it's a 1 with just a line. There's no serif on there. And you apply an inner force to each of the numbers to make them transform into the subsequent number. So in other words, you imagine sort of pushing or pulling on the top of the 1 and pulling it into the shape of a 2. So it just sort of morphs. You don't do like 20 different moves. You try to just sort of keep the one end as you're pulling and pushing on it to turn it. And then you turn that into a 3, and then a 4, and then a 5. And then when you get to the 10, you sort of pull the rounded part and the line part apart. So you do that and just sit there and concentrate. And so you really only do this push-pull motion where you're inwardly exerting pressure or kind of pulling on it to change each number into the next. If you do that, it takes a little while sometimes, but it's completely absorbing, and it is a way of metamorphosing something, and it's a continuity of thought that will help you get into being able to focus as you read, as you try to do your meditation, as you try to practice an instrument afterwards or whatever, because sometimes you need that before you can do the things that you want to do development. Yeah.
That's lovely. Yeah. Well, you're probably watching this on my YouTube channel, so this is where you find me. I think my last one is phenomenologically encounter the 4 classical elements every day. So have a breath exercise for air, touch earth, and feel it, and then phenomenologically encounter it. Same thing with water. The sun counts as fire. I'm heading into the cold, so I actually set a fire every day, and I do that with an awareness. We're on that edge between the artificial and the real. So make sure you take time to be aware phenomenologically of the real, I think. Yeah, guys, this was a killer chat. It was very therapeutic for me, that's for sure, and it's been really fun to watch the firecracker repartee in the actual webinar chat. But thank you very much.
Thank you, guys. It's great talking.
Thanks.
With you.
Thanks a lot, Gordon. Good to meet you, Connor.
Thanks. Yeah, you too. Thanks to everybody for showing up.
Yeah, indeed. All right, I'm going to hit the various stop buttons. So one of them will probably kill the whole webinar. So everyone, again, thanks in the chat, and yeah, good times.
Blue no matter who.